All right, welcome back to our afternoon session, something I'm really genuinely looking forward to, this incredible opportunity to gather together several deans to talk about, reflect on architectural education, to talk about the future of it. I'm just going to give a few opening thoughts to it, talk a little bit about the charge that these deans received, and then we'll launch into their discussions. So Bob kicked us all off Thursday night by talking about the three pedagogical constructs that have formed and informed the design of architectural education as it developed over the course of the 20th century, and whose vestiges remain to this day in the identity of many schools, particularly insofar as there isn't much clarity as to what comes next. We've increasingly turned many times over the last 2 days to these constructs, although not so much as being temporal reference or even as originary datums, but more as providing the essential definitions of architecture as a practice. I would say, however, that discussions of content have been spottier. Bob Sommel talked about content as thematic, as a way to brand. Several others have offered up content as an extension of disciplinary limits. Ed Mitchell, I'm going to pick on you, used the pejorative term of support to talk about content. Ava Lisa referred to the increasing siloization that has inevitably appeared whenever we deal with content. I will say, essentially content was discussed as contingent. I will give kudos to Mark Jarzenbeck for addressing the problematic of content head-on as to whether it was contingent or constituent. And I'd say there's a lot more to be talked about in this regard. But I'm going to push to the other end of this and talk a little bit about authority. Peter Eisenman has lamented the loss of authority in architecture, and I might suggest to you that authority, for good or for not, was as much the determinant of content as it was of method. And I think this is where deans really come into play here. We've already talked for the last couple of days very much about Gropius, Mies, Rudolph, who embodied their authority and imprinted it upon their respective schools. And we would certainly include Bernard Schumi, John Haydock, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk in this camp. We've also had deans who were the arbiters or the cultivators of authority, among them Harwell Hamilton Harris, G. Holmes Perkins, Adele Nod Santos. So in light of this push-pull between pedagogy and authority, I asked each of the deans who are sitting here today to briefly talk about their institution, their program, department, college, school, and determine what they uniquely bring to architectural education as well as to the discipline of architecture. I also suggested to them, even though I hate this word mission, it's very corporate, it is rather useful in our context, what is their institution's mission in regard to architecture. But I also asked each of the deans to talk about how their own vision as a dean for the future of architecture shapes the direction that their institution is taken. We're fortunate today to have a panel of deans who span from having served as deans for decades to a little over a year, from institutions that have had architecture programs for 150 years to one that is a little under a year old, from institutions that are public and private, large and small, although I will say we kind of err a little bit too much, perhaps, on the private Ivy League in this case. And deans are individuals who are practitioners, who are scholars, who are scholar practitioners, and are writers. So the range we see there as well. And I'm looking forward to that discussion. What I'm going to do is briefly, just with a snippet of biographical information, introduce each of our speakers because, again, they'll be talking about how their vision is shaping things, so you'll hear more about that from them than I wish to provide. And at the end of our five deans who are speaking will come up here for what I hope will be an incredibly robust conversation with the audience that will be closing out this incredible conference that we've had. So just so that we're not confusing, we're going to follow the list as put forward in the program, and we're going to begin with Amale Andraos. Amale has been the Dean of Columbia University's School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation for a little over a year, before which she also served as an associate professor there. In addition to Columbia, she has taught at Princeton, Harvard, Penn, Parsons, and the American University of Beirut. She is the co-founder of Work AC, a practice located in New York City, with notable projects such as Public Farm 1 installation in PS1, the addition and renovation of the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston, the Children's Museum of Children's Museum of the Arts, and the Master Plan and Conference Center for l'Assemblée Radieuse in Libreville, Gabon. Before founding her firm, she was an associate at OMA in Rotterdam and New York. Born in Beirut, she has also lived in Saudi Arabia, Canada, France, and the Netherlands. Her Bachelor of Architecture is from McGill, and she has an MArch II from the GSD. Welcome, Amale.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here today to think about pedagogy and where education might be going. So in the interest of time, I'll read a short introduction and then show lots of images, and then you can put the two together. As a School of Architecture and the Built Environment, Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation is at once committed to disciplinary knowledge while also leading the probing of its discipline's foundations and boundaries to produce new forms of scholarship and research, as well as new modes of engagement, of practice, and of action. As our students become accomplished practitioners and or scholars in their respective fields, they learn to weave together creative and technical expertise with strong positions, insightful critique, and the freedom to reimagine their disciplines and practices. Our faculty inhabits a gradient from pure scholarship to pure practice with increasing hybrids in between. Our practitioners engage practice as a form of research, and our scholars produce new knowledge to upend current forms of practice. All share a deep commitment to engaging the world and the urgent issues of our time. The sense of engagement is not new. Columbia's GSAP has always stood against the autonomy of its disciplines relative to the city outside its walls. Today, this engagement must focus on the global, the urban, and the environmental challenges that we face now and in the future, and across all of the disciplines of the built environment. Our array of programs, architecture, but also historic preservation, urban design, urban planning, the critical curatorial conceptual practice program, as well as the real estate development program, have significantly contributed to GSAP's uniqueness and specificity. All of the disciplines gain from the scale and strength of the architecture programs, while architecture gains breadth and impact through its adjacency to other modes of thinking and practice. Today, students and faculty are increasingly crossing over. A useful way to understand the relationship between the programs at Columbia's GSAP is to note that the academic disciplines of the built environment have been constituted following scalar boundaries. The material at the scale of preservation, the building at the scale of architecture, the neighborhood at the scale of urban design, the city and the region at the scale of urban planning. Scale has also divided the question of time, the scale of the past with historic preservation, the scale of the present with real estate development, and the scale of the future with architecture and the other disciplines of the built environment, which are more projective. At a time when the thinking across scales, spatial but also temporal, is urgent, GSAP is committed to advancing its disciplines against their grain. As we strive to reconnect the scale of a brick to that of a building, a city, or an entire territory, making visible the vast resources and interdependencies mobilized by the design and building of each one of those scales, and as we collapse the immediate scale of our lived human experience with the scale of geological transformation that climate change has brought to our consciousness, we are recasting the disciplines of the built environment for the future. Another useful way to understand GSAP and its programs is to outline the range they cover from the humanities to the sciences, with historic preservation on one end of the cultural spectrum and urban planning as a social science at the other, and with architecture in the middle as the intersection of, quote, art and science. While this breadth is both productive and challenging, it is more importantly critical for the school in situating its potential contribution to the university, but also to as well as to the transformation across universities that is happening, as the school can act as an important intersection and bridge between the humanities and the sciences at a time not only of increased divide, but also of erosion of one mode of knowledge at the expense of another. Finally, while each of our programs maintains its autonomy in terms of advancing its own discipline, field of knowledge, and of practice, a productive and alternate way to think about the school is not as a collection of disciplines formed at another time and in response to a much different context, but rather as organized around a set of contemporary concerns that are cut across these programs in light of the issues facing cities and the built environment today. The first would be the notion of scales of environment, or the environmentally conscious thinking and design across scales. The second would be the importance of global engagement as we think across various urban contexts, learning from one to inform another in a constant feedback loop of information. The third would be the particular contribution of visualization as a skill that cuts across the disciplines. Architects do not build as much as they draw, transforming our understanding of urban and environmental contexts to render the invisible visible and draw the much-needed connections across expertise, disciplines, cultures, and scales. The fourth would be the rethinking of technology. Data and information flows are altering the urban at unprecedented scale and speed, presenting opportunities for increased precision, but also for increased control. And finally, the school's strong commitment to grounding professional practices within the critical, historical, and theoretical frameworks necessary to their progressive evolutions, with a commitment to expanding accepted canons and histories and open up new possibilities for knowledge, for engagement, and for practice. While these themes or concerns are far from exclusive, they provide a productive framework to understand the school and the kind of pedagogy beyond its programs and their disciplinary boundaries. So I'll focus today a little bit more on the architecture program in particular. And so this is Avery Hall in Morningside. We've done, the first thing coming in was to rethink not only how we teach, but how we organize ourselves. And so the studios were kind of completely reinvented physically in terms of making them much more collaborative and open, resulting in a very flexible kind of environment that can kind of break down the boundary between, let's say, studio and seminar in terms of modes of learning, allowing for display and kind of high energy exchanges as students kind of produce new models, exhibitions, etc. We've also reorganized the schedule, in fact, to try to find more intersections, both between the kind of design studios, but also between the various studios and the other, what I've heard has been called the kind of support, sequences, which are, certainly more than support, but also to bring the other programs to intersect within the design studio, so that there's a kind of 2-hour slot every week called transfer dialogues, carved out of the design studio time to actually foster kind of conversation around key themes. In terms of the actual curriculum, and I think it was interesting, last year at this time I was at a conference at Brown University, and we were talking about Alvin Boyarsky and how at the time of the beginning of the AA, curriculum was such a loaded word. You could, what's the point of a curriculum? It's everything that's around it that makes sense. But I think that today we are again thinking about curriculum in the sense that unless all of the explorations that we've done over the last 10, 20 years, come to actually impact fundamentally how we teach everything from design to history, then we haven't really done our job. And so a lot of the ideas have kind of infiltrated into the curriculum. For example, Core 1, we're rethinking the ground as water, very literally, to kind of introduce the students to kind of different understanding of environment and the transformed context for today's thinking. And so I'll just show very briefly images from that first semester. Students are really engaged in visualization, new modes of representation. I think there's a kind of radical shift away from renderings, for example, and more towards drawings. In the second semester, the 30,000 square foot building engages questions of structure and sort of kind of playfulness and transformation. Yes, this is it. Very good. And gets, I think program comes into this semester as well as an understanding of section and a kind of urban context. The two semesters that have been changed the most in terms of these larger ideas are the third and the fourth. GSAP has a long history of a kind of very foundational housing semester, and last year we ended the focus on New York alone after 40 years, and this was the exhibition to celebrate the ending of New York's focus on housing, and are taking housing as a lens through which to look at different global urban contexts, but also to look at that, not only the question of housing, but contrasting various typologies, and so across various cultures and contexts. So students in their third semester went and looked at housing in Rio, as well as in Mumbai and in Berlin, and then came back to kind of learn from that to then engage a site in New York, comparing typologies, densities, et cetera. So the notion of constant relational thinking becomes really important, very deep into the curriculum. And these, again, are some of the students. And that has allowed, in a way, to tie some of the kind of research and investigations that is occurring across the network of Studio X to focus around that theme of housing, at least for the last 2 years. That's been the theme, and that in turn informs the student as they travel to these sites. The fourth semester is what we call the scales of environment, where actually we've brought in the new director of urban design, Kate Orff, to work together with David Benjamin to really bring notions of scale, thinking across scale systems to really the architectural curriculum. So this is the urban design studio, and a lot of the kind of large scale, systems thinking is kind of making its way to the architecture curriculum, again, in terms of thinking across scales, from the kind of very material scale to the building scale, and then the kind of much larger scale. So this is just midterm, so I don't have the final, but it's really this crop now. And then advanced studio is, continues to be much more individual in terms of the various explorations and interests of both the faculty and the students. But there's also an opportunity to, again, bring the programs together, such as between historic preservation and architecture, urban design and architecture, et cetera, et cetera. This was a preservation architecture studio looking at the competition in Oslo. Research is critical to the school, but also to the university as part of a very important research university. And so the faculty is engaged in research and engages students in that investigations as well. Of course, the school is built on this notion of research with Avery Library as its kind of foundation. There are a number of labs, the Global Africa Lab, the Asia Megacities Lab, the Latin Lab, and then there are centers, and I just wanted to highlight a few centers. This is the research from the Buell Center, which has been looking at the question of housing for a number of years, working with institutions such as MoMA. So our presence in New York, allow us to kind of tie to other institutions. The Art of Inequality, Architecture, Housing, and Real Estate traveled to the Chicago Biennial, to Berlin, actually, and then more recently to Los Angeles. And then we just launched, the Buell Center just launched the question of power and the space of the planet. There was a fantastic keynote last night by Kim Stanley Robinson looking at science fiction and architecture as a kind of possibility to enter some of the questions that we have today. The Center for Spatial Research is led by Laura Kurgan and uses the kind of visualization skills that I mentioned to try to kind of redraw the world we live in. In fact, this is a map of the world as represented by the movement of oil tankers. This is a project with the Mind-Brain Behavior Institute, and then this is conflict urbanism, or how conflict is shaping cities in Aleppo, but also in Colombia. And so this research kind of engages both our planning students, but also our architecture students. We have another information center called the Embodied Energy Initiative, led by David Benjamin, which is kind of mapping this question of embodied energy across cities. This is New York. There was a map made for Beijing, and there's a conference next week, so looking at the kind of material questions of energy at the material scale, but how they scale up at the entire kind of urban scale. This is just for fun, our little robot. I know you have a bigger one here, but we are trying to integrate, making technology within the space of the studio itself. So we're kind of engaging. GSAP is the iPhone. It will never be the $1 million arm. So events and public programs are an occasion to kind of shape. I have 2 more minutes? 1 more minute? Okay. I'll go very fast, but as you can see in this kind of poster, it's bringing together architects and their body of work and their practice within larger questions. So a lot of the large symposia, such as the architecture and representation of the Arab city, housing the majority, climate change, other desires, the African city, amongst other, bring a kind of much more environmental and global kind of context to the work that we do today. So I'll just show this was housing the majority, experimental preservation, Dipesh Chakrabarti on the question of climate change, culture and heritage after Palmyra. This was a fantastic conference on the African city, on race and architecture, organized by Mabel Wilson. And then Kengo Kuma, the Japanese group, Johnson Mark Lee. So really the idea is that architects are kind of situated within this these larger questions. And also the school really fosters new generation of thinkers, and this was a fantastic talk on new kind of publications with one of our own, Colin, kind of looking at architecture and writing. If you want to know more about our events, please get the new abstract. Exhibitions are a chance for us to change the canon as well. This was on Fuller, and this is a beautiful exhibition on the Iraqi architect Shadirji Rifat, a fantastic modernist who looked at these questions of modernity in the Arab city, and we opened it the day we heard about Zaha, so it was very touching. And then a lot of these conversations are becoming books as part of the Columbia Books on Architecture and the City, as well as the online publication, the Avery Review. And we have now a reading room. And the Avery Review every month gets announced physically as well as online. And then finally, we've expanded. We are looking at architecture, art, and entrepreneurship and technology with the GSAP incubator, working with the new museum downtown, where 30 alumni are looking at alternate modes of practice. And we embrace being in New York in terms of being able to take students across various institutions and sites. And then, travel is really integrated in terms of the sites of kind of inquiry. This is the urban design exhibition on water at Studio X Rio, the Biennale, and then this is Ethiopia. And then Studio X remains part of this kind of global thinking network that is an integral part of the school, and really kind of getting deeper and deeper into the kind of curriculum. And so I will end on the earth. And I'm done. Thank you.
By the way, I just wanted to make something clear to everyone. This is the last of the panels today, but the day closes with deans, and after our panel, we will have our final words from our new dean-elect, Deborah Burke. So this is the last of the panels, but not the last of the day that we're going to have. And of course, as you know, there will be, as always, a reception afterward. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker comes to us from London. He is the founder, his name is Will Hunter. He is the founder and director of the London School of Architecture, and which, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, is currently finishing its first year.
No, we turn 6 months old on the 5th of April.
Okay, 6 months, finishing its first 6 months of operations. We're really looking forward to hearing about this. The school is an offshoot from his previous work as the founder of a think tank titled Alternative Routes for Architecture. He's also held numerous posts in journalism, most recently serving as the executive editor of the Architectural Review and previously as the editor of BD Magazine and AJ Specification. His previous academic experience includes being a tutor at the Royal College of Art and chair of their public lecture programs. He also worked for Alsop Architects. He has a Bachelor of Science in Architecture, Planning in the Built Environment from University College London, and an MA in Architecture from the Royal College of Art. Please welcome Will.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is a great privilege to be presenting a school that's less than a year old at a centenary of a school of the scale and prestige of Yale. I'm going to sort of quickly go through what we're about. The London School of Architecture is a new school for a new century. Our mission is to find the full potential of architecture in a changing world, and we seek students with independent minds, not independent means. We have 3 USPs. We use the city as our campus, so we use all the capital's latent spaces. We don't own our own buildings. We move around. We bring academia and practice into a much closer relationship. We have 50 practice partners in London and 1 validating university. And we have a cost-neutral model. So we have set the fees at £6,000 per year. So for the 2-year program, it's £12,000, and the students earn £12,000 in their 12-month practice placement. So it's kind of free to study with us. They earn while they learn. Why did we set it up? We were very worried that fees were going up to £9,000 a year. That probably seems like a great laugh to you in America. But people took to the streets. They were very angry about it. And then when you look at this graph, this was about architecture. So this is a typical 30-year career. The bottom green is salary, and the top green is student debt. And it's projected that over a typical 30-year career, architects will never pay off their student debt. Now, for me, who wants to bring the best minds into architecture, not just the fattest wallets, this is a very terrifying diagram for anyone who cares about the future of the profession and also the future of the world. We also worried about architects exploiting the world. Howard Rourke, not the greatest team player, ripping off these classical stylings from the sides of Miesian towers, and we felt that actually architects shouldn't just exploit the world and its resources in the modernist way, but there's a kind of more negotiated set of practices. In academia, we worried about this disengagement from reality, and that actually we think reality is more interesting than anything you could invent because it can surprise you, and that architecture has things in it like program and space and light and materials and gravity that make it kind of experientially brilliant and that we kind of want to engage with. We also worried about this sort of, in London, the villainous role of architects producing these sort of bulbous buildings that can't form proper urban fabric but actually positively incinerate. the buildings and people around them, which is sort of slightly terrifying. So we looked kind of at the Architectural Association as our kind of anchor point. Now that set up about 150 years ago when lots of, an article was written in the Builder magazine, and people were fed up the apprenticeship model, and they all got together and they formed a new school. This is Alvin Boyarsky with Zaha. There was a kind of golden moment of the unit system that produced all these great people with Rem and Schumi, and that produced, Nigel Coates, it spawned lots of other schools. And this kind of golden moment that really has been replicated around lots of London schools about the unit system. I did a similar thing. I wrote an article in a magazine called the Architectural Review and asked for people to get in touch with me about who was interested in forming a new school. It was a kind of very long journey which led to the rooftop tower of the Oxo Tower in London. We did a photo shoot that made us look like we were launching CSI London. But yes, we got a lot of stick for that from everybody. And this was the launch for our applications. We had 140 applications for the first year, and we opened October last year. And we took quite a simple model. So we looked at the kind of binary nature of architectural education, academia, practice, and we did a 2-year master's, and we just blended the two things together. And we looked at the kind of conventional nature of a school, this idea that there's this ivory tower of learning with this impenetrable boundary. We made this porous boundary like a membrane that things can come in and out of it. These are all our first years, little triangles, I should explain the terminology of the diagram. The first years are all based in these practices. So the practices are the green things, so 3 days a week. So they work 3 days a week in their first year. The other 2 days a week, they're working on school projects. And we're looking at how to put architecture in different contexts. So particularly within the city, putting it within the kind of the metropolis, into a borough, into the site. And each year the school looks at a different borough and the students look at a particular place and base all their work there. But we also want to put the profession in the biggest scale of the construction industry, the creative economy, but at the largest scale in kind of humanity, geosphere, the planet, and what ethically is our role within that as architects. We agree with Malcolm Gladwell that the 20th century was about lone geniuses, but the 21st century is about smart people working together. So all of our practices and students are in a think tank, and they all collaborate to produce a piece of design research. So we've got 5 think tanks this year: Architectural Agency, Unstable City, New Knowledge, Emerging Tools, and Adaptive Typologies. And they're kind of midway through that think tank project. They should have started designing. They have started designing. It should have happened a little bit further ago, but they're getting there at the moment, so we'll show a bit of that later. In the second year, they progress into the LSA studio. We rent a space for them to work together. But we kind of believe that what you really need when you start an office is a laptop and really good coffee and wireless. So we'll rent a studio and we will move around the city to where kind of suits them. You can't get into the second year without a very clear brief for what you want to do. You have to have a clear critical trajectory. It's not a unit model. We're not saying this is what it's about. We want you to find what your purpose is as a designer so that we can help you to get there. The history, technical, and sustainability, all the different components are all marked within this singular thesis project. The history is actually marked within the portfolio rather than a dissertation. And it's taught by tutors from the practice network, actually about 4 students per thesis supervisor. We believe with Peter Buchanan that architecture is the nexus of all disciplines, actually, as fundamental as language. So this kind of discussion we've been having about the Beaux Arts in relation to arts or the Polytechnic model in relation to science, we think actually architecture touches on all the kind of different things that we want to engage with. So these are all the kind of EU criteria words in a little note of blue that the EU thinks architecture is. But beyond that, we think there's all these disciplines and industries and fields that are producing knowledge in the 21st century at an alarming rate that is so exciting, but that we need to think about what the spatial consequences are of it. And we also agree with Richard Sennett that we don't just want to be multidisciplinary for the sake of it, but use the city as the place that unites these complex forms of knowledge. So underpinning all of that is this kind of dartboard of the city where we move to a different London borough each year. And this is the city as campus. So the students have produced a Google map of what their campus is. I was sort of thinking about this in relation to all the floor plans of the architecture schools downstairs in the gallery, and this is our very 21st century version of it with pins in maps. Our base is at Second Home, which is a new creative hub by Selgascano, the Spanish practice for creative entrepreneurs in Shoreditch. We use Blackhorse Workshop, which has been designed by Assemble as a new public space for making and mending. And then actually we go here, there, and everywhere. So these are all the different places that we've been teaching in the first term. We've been given a free studio by Soho Estates. Our students went to them and said, hey, we want a studio, give us a studio. And they've got 2 floors of the old Foyles bookstore that they've got for free. They've got more space than they can deal with, so they're throwing parties and they're setting up things they can sell, art galleries, and trying to make money from it as well. We've been having lectures in crypts of churches. We've been in the Barbican mezzanine. So we've been all over the place doing teaching wherever we can and being opportunistic. One of our think tanks produced this diagram of all the tools that they use to make their life work at the LSA. And actually, 10 years ago, they realized that the majority of those tools didn't exist. So we found that actually what we do could not happen 10 years ago. It's about new ways of communicating and new ways of working, and it gives it a huge kind of potential to push forward what we're doing. We fit into this context in London of these new schools opening up. So there's one called core-econ, which is an open source school for economics, trying to teach economics as if the last 3 decades had happened. There's a new school called School of Communication Arts 2.0. It's an ad school that has 300 industry partners based on portfolio. There's an open school east, a new art school where students don't pay fees, but they offer 1 day of labor. They do a labor exchange, so they give their time to the school, and that's how they pay for their fees. But we also see ourselves as kind of this new culture of publishing, like Medium, where you try and disseminate your work widely and get it understood by people. So while it's great to be talking to a room full of architects, we also want to be talking to a much wider group of people and trying to communicate our work to as many people as possible. And we see ourselves as kind of part of this disruptive technologies that Airbnb, Vroomie, Tinder are kind of new models of live, work, and play that are ways of connecting things through technology, using the city, making things happen, and that we want to be actually kind of disruptive architecture. But we're not just about being like the Open University and no one meeting, everyone meets in space. So we kind of see ourselves a bit like the Colony Room, which was the kind of iconic London Soho drinking den, where kind of Frank Auerbach and Francis Bacon took his sailors and everyone kind of got to know each other, and they all paid for their drinks with their work and stuck it behind the bar. And it could fit about 40 people. And I think we see ourselves as actually 40 people is quite a good number for a conversation. That's the size we've capped our year at. So we've made our website, which launches next week, into a Swiss graphic design version of the Colony Rooms, which we hope works. The colors change when you go on it, so it's quite warping when you, hopefully it won't cause too many people to feel nauseous, and will be exciting. We now have students, after 3 years of writing 1 million words, longer than the Bible for the accreditation. We have 30 students. We've got 140 applications for next year, 35 acceptances, so we're kind of reaching a critical mass. Nigel Coates is the chair of our academic court. Nigel was one of Alvin's creations at the AA. He got famously, all his work was, all his students were failed by James Sterling. And so he's a kind of renegade master at the top of the school. We also have Leon van Schaik, who our MIT has kind of pioneered practice-based research. So trying to make conscious those design decisions that people are making in their practices. And then our practice network kind of ranges, has 45 people in, but ranges from Reba Gold Medal winners like Cullinan Studio and Rogers Sturt Carver and Partners, Sterling Prize winners Howard Tompkins, architect as artist Will Alsop, Assemble, who won the Turner Prize last year, architects as developer, Solid Space, architects as entrepreneurs. So these guys, Studio Octopi, had this idea about making a Lido in the Thames, and then have crowdfunded it, and they're getting it built. And then our values, so that we really want to be propositional, that we don't just want to be offering a critique, and we don't want to be offering dystopia that we think as architects we have to lead. We want to be relevant, that actually relevance is so important that we're engaged with the wider world, that our work has resonance beyond the confines of our institution. That we're innovative, I mean, it's kind of an overloaded word, but that we think it's important that we push forward architectural culture. That we're metropolitan, that more and more we live in an urban society, that we only can really exist in a city. And that we're entrepreneurial, that we're seeking new ways of doing things, that we're open to new ideas from outside architecture. So just briefly going to show a bit of the work that's starting to be produced. These are a couple of murals produced by our students collaboratively about how they experienced Soho. So we're trying to find new ways of drawing the city. They're looking at its infrastructure, its identity and boundary, its sex trade, and they started to move into proposition. It was like a 2-week proposition project, so looking at how the ecology of Soho might make some ideas for urban agriculture, that waste heat might turn into some forms of spectacle, that latent spaces in the city could be used for co-working and creative entrepreneurs, that the kind of infrastructure of Crossrail might have this sort of wonderful souk-like quality with multiple ground planes as you emerge out into the kind of density of Soho. And this is one of the think tanks. So they're looking at unstable city, they're looking at kind of densification and how you might make somewhere like Rotherhithe, which I don't know what the American comparison would be, but it's a fairly miserable, bleak place. How to give that a kind of metropolitan intensity, but also something that relates different programs to a kind of idea of environment and ecology. And to finish on a few thoughts, I mean, I thought about what Tony Vidler was saying yesterday about Leslie Martin and the 1952 conference, and it really kind of throws architectural education in Britain into these kind of parts 1, parts 2, part 3, that hasn't really changed, and that we can't really be educating people for the profession of yesterday or even of today, but it has to be for the profession of tomorrow. So we have to be thinking about a really projective architectural culture. So a guy called Daniel Susskind, who was worked for Number 10, for David Cameron, came in to speak to us. He wrote a book on the future of the professions. And he says, the challenge for architects is to anticipate the new tasks that will have to be done, to identify those that require their unique talents, and to develop the skills that will therefore be required in years to come. He spoke with Alistair Parvin from 00, who says, as more and more jobs are automated, the last thing of all to be automated will be that particular skill of the designer to synthesize complex, soft, contextual problems. And Peter Buchanan, on the same theme, that actually the architect must be the generalist synthesizer, applying knowledge and discerning what is useful and relevant. And that really the final thought that we've set to our students is that it's not about the world of design, it's about the design of the world, that we really want them to participate in human evolution by designing, and that we think we're a school that's much more a network, not a hierarchy, that we're much more a culture, not a curriculum, that we're much more about education, not training, methods rather than skills, content rather than form, and spirit rather than style. And we think we're at this point of epochal change where you either break down or break through, and we're hoping to kind of get them to that next point where we really push architectural culture forward so we actually understand what architects can do and claim back new territories. Thank you.
Way to break this wide open. It'd be interesting at some point, and I don't know that we'd have time to talk about it today in the question and answer, but we do have a history in this country of new schools of architecture. We actually had a student last night ask a question from Boston Architectural College, used to be the Boston Architectural Center, formed very much in the same model. And then, of course, we also think about Adele Naud-Santos and her new school. Our next speaker is Monica Ponce de Leon, who's in her first semester as dean at Princeton School of Architecture. But before taking on this role, she served as dean of the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan since 2008, where she also was the Eliel Saarinen Collegiate Professor of Architecture and Urban Planning. Prior to Michigan, she was on the faculty of the GSD for 12 years, and she's also taught at Georgia Tech, the University of Miami, and SciArc. She's well known as a co-founder of Office Da with many seminal projects, including the Folded Wall for MoMA's Fabrication Exhibition, the Northeastern Interface Chapel, the McAllen Building, and the Helios House. In 2011, she started her own design practice MPDL Studio with offices in New York, Boston, and Ann Arbor. Born in Venezuela, she has her B.Arch from the University of Miami and her MAUD from the GSD. Please welcome Monica.
So I'm in a little bit of a tough spot because I no longer represent a school in which I was for 7.5 years. And I'm actually too new to talk about Princeton because I've only been there for a couple of months. So I only did have my homework in that I decided to talk about what I consider the state of architectural education today, perhaps, and maybe put more questions on the table rather than solutions and a stance as to what I have done or whether I represent a model of education for anyone to follow. So I am really grateful to be here today. I'm very, very grateful to Bob, but also to Michelle, both of which actually have had a great impact on my thinking about academia. Michelle, because I taught with her at the GSD, and when I say taught with her, I don't mean we were colleagues in the building. Michelle was generous enough to embed herself within my studios and actually travel with me to really crazy places like the Amazon rainforest to talk about design with design students in really extreme circumstances, looking at the world at large. And Bob, because he was dean before me, and his model is one that I not only respected, but in a way I tried to follow. So as Michelle said, I have been in a number of institutions, and what is interesting to me about this conference is that I realized that all of these institutions actually had to start in, some in the Beaux-Arts, some in the Polytechnic model, some in the Bauhaus model, but also they were within the research university except for SciArc, which is of course freestanding and outside of the research university. So in a way you could say that I have seen it all. It might be helpful, however, to look just at the content of schools in the last 10 years and not necessarily their structure. And when you look just at content of schools, and you take a really broad look, when you look at the US as a whole, I believe that schools in the last 10 years, most of them, there are exceptions, have taken two turns. There is one group of schools that see the role and the mission of the architect, and by the way, Michelle asked us to talk about what is the mission of our school, and with all the problems that mission might imply. But there are schools that have seen the mission of the architect as one to solve world problems. And for me, this actually is an uncomfortable position for an architect, and much less a school of architecture, to take. Perhaps I am more humble than that, but to think that actually architects can solve world problems, I believe is an overstretching. So I have been suspicious of those schools that have presented the architect as hero. On the other hand, I think a great number of schools became uncomfortable with the role of the architect and felt that architecture was in crisis, and tried to provide an aura of expertise to architecture by really holding on to technology as something that actually we could become experts in, and really through technology, somehow the field of architecture, the discipline of architecture, could be saved. This is also a position that makes me uncomfortable. Perhaps because when I look at the work that has come out of this fascination with technology, I see a certain degree of variation and sameness, whose conflation seems to be, again, something that makes me uncomfortable in the world and in the discipline of architecture. So I would argue that both these trends have led us nowhere, that they have both hit dead ends, and that they have really left us in a really difficult position as to how to move forward in a positive way. And I'm a really optimistic person, so I don't like dead ends. I want to get out of them. I have to say that at Yale, with his pluralistic model for studio, Bob really deftly avoided all of these traps. And I certainly, at the University of Michigan, really follow in Bob's lead of a pluralistic model. But in an era of rapid access to information and this proliferation of images, pluralism actually has been unable to stop what I call the everything goes attitude that today prevails in the discipline and in the profession. And worse, my generation has watched in horror those very projects that we did in school or early in our practices that we thought were so critical or that we thought were so somehow resistant of the status quo. We have seen those very strategies appropriated by corporations and proliferated around the globe. Mark Jarsonberg's slide earlier of the grid of buildings that looked all the same, for me, is very much a case in point. So where to start? I am a nerd, so I always want to start at the beginning. Like Mark, I believe that we are producers of cultural discourses. And I do believe that we have to re-examine our curriculums to enable faculty and students to construct culture at large. But how? We always talk about architecture being at the intersection of the humanities, the arts, and the sciences. And I certainly believe that architecture is probably the only field that occupies that position. But this statement is actually dangerous as a model for an academic structure because it can actually reinforce divisions between what became to known as sub-disciplines within architecture, pedagogical divisions that in my mind have proven to not be useful. Yesterday, Tony spoke of history of theory as design, as if history of theory are one and the same. And I do believe that perhaps by understanding design, not merely at the intersection of the humanities, the sciences, and the arts, but understanding design as all of those and more might be a clue as to how to move forward pedagogically. I also think that to move away from a model of design and as research may actually be a healthy turn in the discipline. I realize this is a strange thing to say after so many years of so many people fighting for design to be research or for design to be understood as research. I also know that being at the research university, it's scary actually to say, actually design is not research. And I say this because the reason we have claimed design as research is a way of somehow validating our presence within the research university. But it might be more powerful, and it actually might be more consequential, to argue for design as a creative practice. And it's interesting, actually, to see at the research university today and to see how other disciplines use the term design. They don't mean what we mean. They think they know what they mean. But actually, design, which is at the core of what we do in the discipline of architecture, has been used and misused, appropriated, and changed around in different ways in many other disciplines, and it's actually very important to many other disciplines today. So why do I want to create a differentiation between research and creative practice? One of the powers that we have as architects is that we construct alternatives to the present. We construct alternatives to the status quo. We do it through actually putting physical things in the world. We do it through drawing. We do it through writing. And it is, for me, this ability to construct alternatives to the status quo where the power of the architect as one that is part of society at large lies. So rather than speaking about a change in content, how do we restructure the studio sequence? What studio should have what topic when? I think what we should talk about perhaps is a reconfiguration of the studio itself as one that is a key to the curriculum. And I have to confess, I really don't know what that means, but I do know that the idea of the master studio, one that is very close to my heart because I was educated under the notion of the master studio, is one that has run its course. And I do think we have to find alternatives to the master studio that go beyond changing content, where in fact the studio needs to be rethought, not as a teacher that has expertise that is imparted into the students, but perhaps as a different thing that has a different relationship between those who teach and those who are learning. So I think I'm going to leave it at that and hope that we can elaborate this further during the conversation.
All right, this is shaping up to be what I think is going to lead into a fabulous conversation at the end. Our next speaker is Hashim Sarkis, who has been Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT for just over a year. Before that, he was at the GSD as the Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism. He's also taught at the American University of Beirut and at the Metropolis program in Barcelona. Since 1998, he has been principal architect at his firm Hashim Sarkis Studios, with offices in Boston and Beirut. Many of us are familiar with his balloon landing park in Beirut, which he's shown here, I believe not last time, but a previous time when you lectured here, and his housing for the fishermen, and please forgive me for mispronouncing towns in Lebanon. Tyre, okay, I knew I was going to pick the wrong one, as well as the soon-to-be-finished and completed Byblos Town Hall. Before founding his own practice, he was a founding member of Plan B, not the contraceptive method, but the urban studies group. Also born in Beirut, it's interesting that two of our newest deans were born in. You were born in Beirut, right? I just assumed that we've got two deans now born in Beirut. Hashim has his B.Arch and BFA from RISD, his M.Arch II, and his PhD from the GSD. Please welcome Hashim.
I have no pictures, and I would rather see your faces. Is there a possibility for lights being turned up? Can I do? Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me to this amazing panel. And I do agree with Michelle that it's building up. And I do feel that the transition from what Monica was talking about to what I will be talking about is going to be rather smooth. A year into it, what is the view from MIT? If we talk about the research university, MIT is truly the model. An institute, not a university, consisting of 5 schools, 11,000 students, of which about 650 are in the School of Architecture and Planning, considered the oldest school of architecture in the United States. Of these 600, only 1/3 are architects. The others are in the field of urban studies and planning, in the field of media arts and sciences. The media lab is part of the school, in real estate, and also in the arts. The architecture program is about 250 students, a bit more, a bit less, depending. And internally, it's also organized in a very unique structure that I will refer to when I present my comments. As dean, I sit on the academic council, which meets once a week. And unlike universities that are based in the humanities, this is a university that is very much led by engineers. Those meetings start on time, and they usually finish 5 to 10 minutes ahead, where we've covered all the items of the schedule and solved many problems. I have yet to get used to the rule of engineers, but in the meantime, I've been tasked with the responsibility of curating discussions about the future of design at MIT. And in that capacity, I've confronted many of the challenges that many of you have alluded to in terms of the positioning of architecture and design within a research setting. So a year into it, I can say a few things about how architecture sits in the university. And my comments are titled Double Scrutiny: Architectural Education in the Face of Scientific and Social Inquiry. I'm going to ask a simple question and then try to flesh it out. The question is, how can architectural education effectively respond to the increasing scrutiny of architecture by science and by the democracy? I will treat this question in two ways. In the first, I will examine this growing scrutiny as a source of tension between architecture and the university, but also as a potential for better assimilation. And in the second part, I will reflect on how architecture can maintain its distinction within and against the incursions of the physical and social sciences, and outline what could be not perhaps a model or a position, but a response or a series of responses to this double scrutiny that I see traces of at MIT. Firstly, architecture and the research university. Increasingly, architecture schools, as you've heard again and again, are being asked by their universities, are you capable of partaking in research culture? This change of emphasis on the part of universities from education to research has caught professional schools, including architecture, by surprise, in the sense that the prevalent models of architecture education up till now, the models of apprenticeship and humanities-based introspection, are being questioned for their inability to contribute effectively to the research culture of the university and to the collaboration with the industry, mostly to the collaboration with the industry. This is not only specific to architecture, but could be extended to other professional schools and arguably to the humanities as well. Look at the proliferation of the phenomenon of digital humanities as a symptom of that. So in effect, the university wants those pockets of trade schools to become research schools. It wants the studio, as Monica was saying, to become the laboratory. These questions and incitements may be new, but the tension between architecture and the university is not. A structural fault has shaped that relationship since the beginning. In face of the university's constant interrogation about its disciplinary integrity, architecture has been reacting either by isolating itself from the academy, and we've done that at MIT a few cycles, or by borrowing academic credentials, including epistemologies, from the humanities, the social sciences, and technology. This borrowing practice has become integral to the way we break down our discipline into subdisciplines that carry the names of these lending banks. One would only expect this tension to have been aggravated by the university's growing emphasis on research. In some ways, it has. This could be illustrated in the reaction to the question of research by jumping into the methods and topics of science and technology headfirst. The utility factor has also further aggravated this tension. Watch how, for example, we have been adopting a holier-than-thou strategy towards every crisis that society is confronting, from the environment to poverty to traffic jams. This baby has been adopted along with its dirty bathwater. In response to these pressures, a new model of architecture education is emerging. One where there is an increasing emphasis on the one hand on technology and fabrication, and on the other on social impact, where the methods of technological research and the social sciences have invaded the in vitro insularity of the studio, and where every undertaking is being validated by its impact or utility, and therefore by sponsorship from the industry. One would also have expected that the artistic dimension of architecture would have drowned in this wave. But an unexpected flotation device has been thrown to us from the business world that has all of a sudden discovered design, even if the aesthetic, heuristic, and iterative attributes of design method have been eclipsed by the entrepreneurial and innovative qualities attributed to design. Everybody in the industry talks about the now exhausted iPhone example and believe that its success is tied one way or the other to the additional value that design brought to Apple. I don't know how many times you've seen a business person carry the iPhone up as evidence that design matters. I left my iPhone there. As the university has become more interested in creative thinking, innovation, and collaboration, it has discovered architecture and the methods of research and study that have been nurtured for a long time under the guise of professional training. The studio model, design thinking, object-oriented approach, making, teaching while researching. The studio, as Monica indicated, has become like a big commodity for everybody. They come to us asking us, how do you teach studio? If anything, the university is now looking to architecture to articulate what it had been instinctively practicing for a very long time. The university's gaze remains skeptical, however, much like Alice when she wandered in Wonderland if the blue caterpillar ever thought about which leg to move first. Remember that when trying to answer this question, the caterpillar was not able to walk ever again. So despite the skepticism, what could be transformative about this moment is that design, more so unfortunately what is now labeled design thinking, is being elevated to its own form of knowledge, to an epistemology of sorts, on par with the scientific and humanities-based methods on which the university has built its value systems. And that if this is to be taken further, it should suggest a very reconsideration of scientific method itself. Unfortunately, that has yet to happen. In his essay, A Few Steps Towards a Philosophy of Design, famous one, Bruno Latour suggests that an ethic of design distinguishes it from the problem-solving approach of engineering. This ethic is based on a modest approach of improving solutions that have already been reached by engineering and making them better, adding a value system of good and bad to what engineers consider right or wrong. Latour could have taken this further by looking into the history of exclusion of design from engineering and scientific method from the very beginning. As much as programs like History, Theory, and Criticism at MIT or other history programs or Science, Technology, and Society programs everywhere have played a role in critically exposing the impurities of scientific method, they are really yet to effectively impact the way scientists and engineers think of what they do, and the way they continue to claim rationality and somehow to place what designers do outside of rationality, as if there is anything outside of rationality. What prevails, in the meantime, is an increasing exposure of architecture to the scrutiny of science, to performativity, rationality, and fallibility, and to the scrutiny of the political and deliberative processes, and to values related to social equity. And I think architecture at MIT is basically situated physically, practically, methodologically within those two realms. I would further argue that in a context like MIT, where John Dewey's tenet of learning by doing resonates all the way from the Institute's motto, mens et manus, mind and hands, to everything we teach and do. And here, democracy, like in Dewey, is understood as the application of scientific method to the solution of social problems. Every time we want to know what students think, we quantify their thinking. Science, it turns out, is closing in on us from both ends, from its own end and that of social engagement, reducing the space of what we consider design to a value added to engineering, or worse yet, to an entrepreneurial skill. But I also want to note a change in tone. The critical tone or role that form was supposed to play in relation to social structures has been giving in to instrumentality. We are now solving social problems through design. As Monica indicated, we are saving the world. We are using architectural technology to make the world more accessible, responsible, and efficient. And despite warnings that the social equity dimension is not directly linked to access to technology, sometimes quite the contrary, we continue to promote such formal explorations as parametricism, and I'm just using this as an extreme example, not putting the best face on it, but it's worse, as a tool to achieve social equity through making form more flexible. So along these lines, I also observed that despite the embrace of new technologies and methods, this positivist tone has not been able to displace or question the main categories with which we ourselves have been working. For example, for all of our investigations into new technologies and new materials, we seem to be still predominantly abiding by his Amperian tectonic logic of structure to skin. William Faulkner once described architecture as the furniture of time. Despite the intensity of the scrutiny and the earnestness of our response, we are still playing the role of the reupholsterers, not the cabinet makers of this furniture. So let me turn to maybe responses from architecture's point of view, or what I'm referring to as architecture's distinction. So, how can architecture education respond to such phenomena in effective ways without architecture losing its distinction? As schools of architecture, we not only absorb what is going on around us, but we take a position. We should take a position. I believe that when Robert took a position in the middle of a morass that was going on at the time, we actually had to realign. The different schools had to respond, take a position. And that, I think, is very healthy. And I'm hoping that we are all pushing and yearning towards articulating positions. I do believe that adopting one or more of the following positions is going to create the schools of thought within the schools of architecture in the years to come, and that the terms of this debate should become clearer as we begin to articulate our positions about them. I would like to outline two general positions within which one could identify many others. One way to react to this double scrutiny and the phenomena that come with it is to embrace them and take them to the hilt, to see what they are able to do to architecture and its principles. Can, for example, new technologies really help us transcend the tectonic versus stereotomic divide? Can full social engagement ultimately displace the designer? Can design and science talk directly without the mediation of technology? These are the kinds of questions I see being asked at MIT, and I think they are welcome questions to this kind of total immersion in the scrutinies. If in the academy we are not able to do that, then who is? In parallel, we could also embrace the methods of science fully, subject architecture to the methods of science, and like Tomás Maldonado did at Ulm, insist that there will be no aspect of architecture that will remain outside of scientific rationality if we keep trying. This total surrender may actually have two positive outcomes, even though I do not fully buy it. At one level, it may blur the boundary between science and art, between the engineer and the designer, and expose how much of scientific method is iterative, intuitive, and should I say how much of it is aesthetic. How much scientific method is itself a specious act of self-purification. At another level, this process may actually prove that there is a core to architectural knowledge, that the more we ask the architectural question in non-architectural terms, that a residue will remain, and that this residue will turn around to become what we define positively as the core, as the basis of our design thinking. These are the kinds of exercises that I see also taking place at MIT, not just within architecture, but around in the different design fields, especially Media Lab and mechanical engineering. And I hope that these will inform us much better as we move forward. The other less direct approach is to insist that our role really as architects is to make visible new phenomena emerging as a result of social engagement and democracy, and as such relegate to the architect a role of representing, aestheticizing technology and society and giving it imagery, putting the best face on it. Here, the role that architecture has played in relation to science fiction, which was referred to earlier, and science fiction movies, is a good example that we cannot think of this technological future without its architectural representations. In short, we could insist that what remains unique to our domain, to the aesthetic, is its ability to make visible. Related to that is the argument that new technologies and new forms of living together will affect us the most by affecting the way we see. By looking at the world through eyes informed by new technologies and new societies, we will be able to perceive the spaces differently and then perhaps design them differently. We should invest in understanding and expressing the habits and values of this new subjectivity. Then, new forms will inadvertently follow. To think of it, this was the position of Sigrid Gideon towards new technologies. I do confess, at this very provisional end to my comments, that what interests me the most is to enlarge the operative space for architecture. The space we start from is already sanctioned by society and science. After all, democracy upholds the space of individual expression, and science continues to marvel at how the world could become. No matter how much we appear to be giving in to scientific rationalism and to democratic deliberation, we remain capable of the unexpected. We remain capable of breaking the bounds, of revising the norms, of making infinite connections, of proliferating possibilities, but also of carefully timing our anachronisms, of producing new forms of space that inspire new forms of life, and of exercising what the poet John Keats has described as our inherent negative capability. We should strive, and I strive, to recast this capability among architects in more positive terms. Thank you very much.
I don't want the day to end. Our last speaker in this panel is Jennifer Wolch. She is the William W. Worcester Dean of Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, a post she has held since 2009. Before Berkeley, she was a professor of geography and urban planning at USC, where she was on the faculty for 30 years, serving as the founding director of the university's Center for Sustainable Cities. A notable and prolific scholar in urban analysis and planning, she has written on subjects ranging from homelessness to public health to environmental justice. Among her books are Up Against Sprawl, Public Policy in the Making of Southern California, and this title, I have to read this, Animal Geographies, Place, Politics, and Identity in the Nature-Culture Borderlands. She has her BA in Anthropology and her MA in Geography from California State University in Hayward, and her PhD in Urban Planning from Princeton. Please welcome Jennifer. And I think we're going to lower the lights as well.
Michelle.
Where's the clicker?
Oh, it's just okay. Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you everybody for being here all day into the late afternoon. I want to thank the organizers very much for inviting me all the way over from the left coast, and also congratulate Bob on his departing event here. And I've really enjoyed learning about Yale over the last couple of days, and hope I can say a few things about Berkeley that may strike in some resonant ways. The College of Environmental Design, this is an early sketch of its building, Worcester Hall, was founded in 1959. And I'm going to say a few words about the formative context of the college, and then talk a little bit about some of the through lines, the things that have been defining about the college since its inception, really, and then talk about some of the things, the mission, and some of the things that I've tried to do as dean. One of the things about being in Berkeley is that you're 3,000 miles away from Yale, Princeton, Harvard, and MIT, and Columbia. And if you think about the formation of the college, it really happened during the development of the California Master Plan for higher education, the building of UC campuses around the state, and a dramatic growth in California population and urbanization. And this is an Ansel Adams picture looking over the Golden Gate across the university, taken during the 1960s. So on the one hand, we were isolated, but on the other hand, the isolation itself and our preoccupation with California really in some ways meant that we were also free to think in new ways and do different things. So in some ways, we had the freedom to create a different kind of culture and have a slightly different set of goals and objectives. Now, this is Worcester Hall. Someone recently said, oh, it's kind of a poor man's Rudolph Hall. This is actually taken last week. Bill Worcester wanted it to be seen by the UC Regents as a ruin. I think a lot of my colleagues would agree that we've attained that goal. I think of it as not only a 210,000 square foot building the 55-year-old building that I have to maintain, but also as a concrete tanker that is difficult to navigate. Berkeley has about 35,000 students. The college has about 1,000 students. We're formed on the basis of shared governance in the university. That means the faculty control the curriculum. It is definitely not a top-down operation, as I'm repeatedly told. And and so you'll see that there's a bit of anarchy that goes on. Okay. This, again, is one of those Ansel Adams pictures of this early studio work done in Worcester Hall. The formative context, free speech movement. Here's Sproul Plaza, Mario Savio, and so on. Worcester Hall was the center for all graphic production that really helped mobilize the protests against the war. The Guerrilla Graphics was founded in Worcester Hall, and there was a 24/7 production of posters that really helped students visualize and articulate their opposition to the war. People's Park, of course, that's when Reagan sent in the troops and the tear gas. It still exists as an open space, I have to say. No one's really figured out how to deal with the third rail of the University of California, Berkeley, which is doing something about People's Park. Also, this was a time of a lot of impact from Black Power, the Black Panthers that started in Oakland, and also La Raza and Chicano Latino power movements. So what are the through lines at Berkeley? It's a pretty big place. It's not always easy to discern those through lines, but I'm going to focus on 5. Environmental design, the idea of environmental design, the commitment to design and place, or design in place, with the specificities of place in mind, environment and sustainability, always a preoccupation, design research and experimentation, and policy and social engagement. I think these are hallmarks of the school. They're not unique, I don't think. There are many other schools that share some of these through lines, but I think they are certainly characteristic of what's happened over time at Berkeley. Environmental design, Berkeley was really formed as a college. Architecture had been there was instruction in architecture starting in the year 1900, but when Bill Worcester got to Berkeley and challenged the Beaux-Arts curriculum and really transformed it into a more modernist place, he also got into a kind of fast crowd of landscape architects and planners, and started to think, I think, more broadly about the built environment and its fields, and became convinced that we wanted some new field called environmental design. And the group that he hung out with was called TELESYS, Planning for Progressive Change. This was really the kind of founding set of ideas for the College of Environmental Design, starting in 1940, and by 1959, he convinced the university to found the college. And here is one of the early diagrams for the building. You can see quite a few things here. First of all, there was a fourth department, which wasn't decorative arts. It used to be. It was called the design department. Very Bauhaus. Sculpture, textiles, photography, many of those art practices. We shared the building initially and still with some of art practice, ceramics and sculpture. You can see city and regional planning, you can see landscape architecture, you can see the library. What you don't see here really is the very large shop that was also part of the thinking that went behind this building. There was a library for thinking, theorizing, learning, and there was a shop for making, doing, and devoting oneself to craft. One of the other things that you might notice here is that everything was a lab. It wasn't a studio. Now, they are studios, but they were called labs, and that was very much of a post-war, techno-rational kind of label. But you also see in the early designs for the building, judgment rooms. So we kind of had one foot in the atomic age and one foot in Paris. Okay. One of so through line clearly is environmental design. I was alarmed this morning when Dan Barber said environmental design, well, Berkeley, and then it collapsed. No one had told me, I guess. But I think I hope to show you that in some ways it still is. It's always a work in progress, no doubt. But it still has, I think, some resonance in Berkeley, at least. I want to talk a little bit about design in place. This college grew out of a tradition in architecture, which has been called the Bay Area regional modernist style, with a lot of residential work as well as commercial and a lot of institutional work. I'm going to show some residential work, included clearly Worcester himself. Joe Esherick, this is a San Francisco house, just went for $11 million. Very much closely connected, this architecture is very much closely connected with landscape architecture. This is a case study house with a landscape designed by Garrett Ekbo, who was on the faculty in landscape architecture at Berkeley. Even the white box person at Berkeley, Don Olson, designed houses with a really fine attention to the detail of setting and site and environmental context. And I think that this is something that certainly came to fruition also in Sea Ranch. You see some of the founding figures, one very familiar to people from Yale. I was delighted to hear finally an explanation of why Berkeley studios are such an incredible mess, and obviously that's something that Moore inspired, and it's definitely true to this day. So Sea Ranch, not only the architecture, but the landscape architecture by Lawrence Halprin, very much a challenge of designing with nature, designing for place. Today, that tradition continues. The materials are not necessarily the same. The technologies may differ. This is a house by Mark Anderson with a lot of innovative both energy features as well as material and project delivery features. And also, you can see this in a lot of the landscape architecture, in this case, Walter Hood's Plaza at the new Broad Museum in Los Angeles. Environment and sustainability, definitely a major through line at Berkeley. Now people are starting to recover this history. There's the new work on hippie modernism, which is being crafted by people at Berkeley like Greg Castillo, but also it's being recovered by other historians of the period. And it didn't, of course, just happen in Berkeley, but in some ways Berkeley maybe was ground zero. You probably recognize Ant Farm, enclosed in plastic, standing in front of Worcester Hall. We still do inflatables in year one. So some things have a long tradition. But also very quickly, especially in the 1970s, we were, I think, as a college, very much linked to the whole Earth catalog movement, the environmental movement. There was some love for the techno-gizmo at this point, but also how to think in whole systems terms with the integral house and the energy pavilion that was built outside of Worcester Hall, led by Sim Vanderen, and the idea that environmental design really had to take the environmental crisis and environmentalism seriously and devote itself, both in terms of design and technology and aspiration, and also as a matter of ethics, to design buildings, places, and use materials that they didn't say sustainability, but that's really what they were after. This also has been a very strong through line through the decades at Berkeley. And I'm going to talk about research in a minute, but also it still is very much at the forefront of design activities of the faculty. This is the Net Zero Packard Foundation headquarters in the Bay Area with daylighting designed by Susan Ubalotti, who is a member of the faculty. Design, research, and experimentation, I think the words about, how does an architecture, design, planning, landscape school, a college of environmental design, in our case, exist within the context of a large research university, often dominated by science and engineering. I think that research, both design research, which we define both as research in a kind of conventional sense, but also creative practice, this has been extremely important throughout the history of the college, and also along with it, experimentation with materials, structures, and so on. This is an early shot of the urban simulation lab. It was an analog simulation lab used to understand urban form, daylighting, shadow, a lot of shadow studies done. This was actually designed by Don Appleyard. To today's Center for Built Environment, which does simulation models with dummies and computer technology to work on energy efficiency in buildings. Maker Labs, this is a big 3D printer lab run by Ron Rael Print Farm. To biomimetic design and biotechnological design in the work of Paz Gutierrez. So very much basic research, but always with an eye to how to move these things to practice. Visualization and simulation modeling, especially in the planning department, and a link with LBNL, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories. This is the new Flex lab that is a testing lab for environmental performance of materials and facades. The other thing about research is design has always been a very important part of the college, of course, but there have been a lot of other preoccupations that are linked to the city and linked to buildings. I assume a lot of these books are familiar to people in the room, and they tackle a variety of issues from architecture, pattern language, for example, streets and urban design, urban history, but also urban sociology, activism, urban history, architectural history on a global scale. Of course, Gustav had a very important role, affordable housing and cities and health. So this kind of scholarship also, I think, has a long history in the college and shapes the thinking and discourse in the place. Okay, policy and social engagement. I think that really is an important aspect of this school, starting with Catherine Bauer Worster. I think the architects in the room think of William Worster, but his wife, Catherine Bauer Worster, was the probably the most important affordable housing advocate of her day. And was the senior author of the 1939 Housing Act, the nation's first affordable housing act. But this kind of link to policy and practice, really, it goes back a long way, and it goes all the way to the present day. The landscape here with the building was a project by CED faculty. Actually, it was New Deal housing for migrant workers. It goes back before the founding of the college, but those preoccupations move all the way forward to the new plan for climate change through land use planning and transportation planning that is part of California state law through Plan Bay Area. and a lot of effort to changing building regulations and building control systems in order to promote energy efficiency. Another part of the activism of this place is its early preoccupations with community design, disability, and the built environment. And this extends to work on homelessness, work on other kinds of forms of marginalization, social inequality, inequity, health disparities. And I think that starts in the 1970s and actually has had a lot of impact both on students, but also on practitioners and actually policy and law. That kind of activism still goes on. During the Occupy movement, there were tents in front of Sproul Plaza. The campus and the police said there can be no more tents on the ground in Sproul Plaza, so environmental design students went to REI, they bought tents, they inflated them, and they took them down to Sproul Hall where they floated them. So they were not just obeying the police, but they obviously were protesting their inability to occupy what they felt was their space. Now, from vision to practice, that gives you a bit of a grand sweep about the college, but as dean, arriving in 2009, 2 weeks before an enormous budget cut, it's always great to walk into a crisis. The question that Michelle asked was, what are your goals? How have you been able to implement things that you wanted to see happen in the school? We actually have a mission statement. I don't think it's particularly shocking or surprising. It's probably similar to other schools that have this kind of structure and history. And we also did a strategic plan, maybe a risky thing to do, but I decided to do it anyway. And after a year of faculty discussion and workshops and working groups, we developed a detailed set of goals and objectives and values, but also we boiled it down to 6 initiatives. We decided as a group we wanted to have more impact from our research. We wanted to develop facilities for design and technology research. We wanted to insert things in the curriculum that bridge the fields in a more fundamental way, in an institutionalized way. We wanted to focus on diversity and develop ways to talk about diversity and inject it into discourse in new ways. We wanted to redo our 1964 original studios. I'm all for sustainability, but enough is enough. They really need to be redone, so we're starting this year. But we want them to be flexible and much more collaborative in the way I think others have spoken about. And we also wanted to use Worcester Hall in a more productive way for informal learning, social interaction, and much more as a lively workspace. And we've just redone our second floor lobby. We're redoing our restaurant, and in a variety of other ways, energizing the building and having a lot more student work visible for students and faculty to learn from each other. I've also embarked on some curricular innovations with the faculty, of course. We revised our lower division breadth requirements. So students start in year 1 at Berkeley in the College of Environmental Design, and we created 3 breadth courses: Design and Activism, Global Cities, and Future Ecologies. They're all team taught by faculty from each department, and they really try to give beginning students kind of intellectual frameworks and structures on which to build their later, more specialized knowledge. We introduced a new college-wide major, Sustainable Environmental Design. In year 2, it has 100 students already. We were able to, I can't even spell my own school, Berkeley RUP. We had a very generous bequest, and over a few years, I was able to work with a group of architects from around the country to develop a prize and professorship program for architects that have worked and contributed to gender equity in the profession and whose work reflects the values of community and sustainability. And that's something that I hope will have an ongoing impact as people come through the school, spend time, work with students and faculty. We've tried to do more super studios. We had 5 in different parts of Asia over the last 5 years, and that experience has been very formative for the students that have participated. We are in the process of proposing to the university a new Masters of Real Estate Development and Design program. And which we think will be a place where faculty from all 3 departments really interact in a useful and interesting way, with a very Berkeley kind of flavor to it. And as Eve talked about earlier today, and Mark talked about yesterday, we are part of the Mellon Foundation program, and our version of that is a program with the humanities called Global Urban Humanities, in which we have done a variety of pedagogical experiments, research studios, and other ways that have really linked the humanities and environmental design fields. And I just want to call out the first Berkeley Rep professorship and prize winner, Deborah Burke. Where are you, Deborah? And just to show you Deborah's studio, Deborah's office, I should say, that she recreated in Worcester Hall for her time at Berkeley. And it was a place where she met students, hung out, and people got to understand in a visceral way how she worked and a little bit about how she thinks. Am I out of time? So, all right. I'm going to stop here. I won't talk about the experiments in pedagogy, but just to say that they're ongoing for the next few years, and I think we're going to learn a lot from them. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Can we quickly gather all 5 of you up here? Obviously, this is something that I would love to go well into the evening talking about, but as we know, that's no longer reasonable at this point. Just one quick comment before I open this up to questions from the audience, and I know this is something that's going to engender quite a few questions from the audience. My hope for this panel is that we would see 5 instances of 5 different individuals in 5 different schools. Instead, I feel as though we received, a representative painting of what's happening contemporarily in the field of architecture. It's actually quite remarkable. And even though it might have seemed as though all 5 of these were extraordinarily diverse, the one thing that I noticed, or the 2 things I noticed that brought them all together, was one, this increasing concern with the kind of rapid proliferation of what we'd call, the content on the edges, on how we reach out into that content on the edges. But it's proliferating at a rate I think is almost unheard of, and how we're trying to grapple with it. But also, which I found quite curious and I wasn't expecting, but it also came up in bits of each of these talks, was also a question about what is actually the center. And I think I really responded to Hashim's comment that the center is the residue that's left behind. So I think, as we began this symposium very much in the 19th century, where the center and the boundaries were neatly and tightly defined, we have seen quite a dramatic shift in both what that center is and what those boundaries are. But I would like at this moment to open this up, this group up into questions from the audience. I'm assuming there should be several. But we're going to have to limit them because, again, we want to hear from Deborah and we also want to drink.
Yes. That's the Yale way.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your talks, very loud. Most of your discussion about the future of architectural education is obviously coming from the viewpoint of administrator, from the viewpoint of planner, and I'm curious what you see the role of students in reforming the architecture school's existence is in your experiences.
Berkeley.
I think the students at Berkeley aren't too shy, and they actually regularly make demands and ask for change, and the current I think request is really about how to weave questions about difference into the curriculum, so that's something that I think that the faculty is taking quite seriously, and that we're going to be working on. But I think that they have been involved in a lot of the discussions about where to go, and are fairly vocal about it.
I think at Princeton, the students are everything. Because it's such a small school, the debates are with students about the work that is being produced by the students. The reviews are very unique in that you don't have the typical panel of jurors and then the student. The students are with the jurors having conversations about the work that is being presented. So that kind of boundary erasure is one that has been characteristic of Princeton for a long, long time, and that has led to Princeton being extremely experimental, extremely resistant to just simply repeat what has been handed down over time, and is one of the things that I think will allow us to create a curriculum that perhaps can break from some of the norms that have been dragging design down.
I think it's absolutely correct. I think completely fundamental for us, what the students, the challenge to them was they arrive on the first day and they're all new and there's no culture. So there's no one for them to look up to at all. And it was to actually make the culture, and to make it afresh each year. That we don't want a kind of unit methodology where you learn to design like a particular unit master, and you can tell who's been in which unit at the end. That you bear responsibility for making your own critical trajectory and bringing the things into the school, and that we're kind of open to that. We can provide an armature, but actually we can't spoon feed you, because then you get to the end of it and you're either kind of fat with things you don't want to vet anyway, and then you don't really know where you want to go. So I think the thing is, unless you're kind of asking those questions as you're going along, that's not really what education's about.
Are we allowed to ask questions? I was very interested in the model. I thought the model was exciting. You had me at the edge of my my chair, sorry. But then, thank you. But then you showed the poster with the names of the design studio instructors, and once again we reverted to what all of us in this panel and others in the audience would do, which is to show which ones are the master teachers that are coming to teach. And I was wondering why you felt you had to do that as an institution, but also in the presentation, and what kind of reaction the students have to that. Because I would imagine as a student, if I'm going to your school, it's precisely because I'm not interested in going to another institution to study with the master architect.
Yeah, I think we show that partly because we made that presentation to investors. So we want to give a sense that we are backed by credible people who've built a lot. And I think we have a faculty who've built, 50 practices have built a lot of London and built around the world. And we're not ashamed, big practices, successful practices are a condition of practice that we're completely engaged in. That might be someone's ambition. So we also have lots of different practices operating in different ways, but I don't think we want to weight the dice towards a particular way of doing things. That there's multiple ways of practicing, and that to make that dialogue in a school, we want all those different things happening. But you're right, we did put the gold medal winners at the top.
I just wanted to add something regarding the students' role at MIT. One student told me that he thought when he got admitted that he got admitted to the Department of Architecture, but ultimately he found himself to be at MIT. And there's a very strong dominance of the ethos of the place as one that permeates to everything, which as a result introduces back into the school many of the values that MIT at large, particularly its undergraduate population, it's much more coherent, brings to the table. And they basically bring new values which we constantly have to respond to. Now, our undergraduate program is small, which means that as a result, the graduate program culture dominates, and the graduate culture is very different in the sense that people really devolve back to their units. So someone, you say, what program are you in? They say, I'm MIT Architecture, HTC, AKP. So everybody has this kind of narrowed down view of where they belong, which creates small, very, very coherent groups. But it does also introduce very different values, which we now need to mediate back up to the larger culture. In some cases, it has created very interesting dynamics. In some other cases, like last week, I had to mediate a pizza war between the planning students and the architecture students. Because at the party, which was supposed to be between the two groups, the planners bought the pizza and the architects ate it. And now, now we no longer have common parties.
You needed to give them a drink.
I mean, it's a really interesting time. I think I'm not sure who, it came up earlier today, with the amount of information that students are fed, not fed, but are engaged with. I mean, they are just, it's a different generation. They're incredibly savvy, and I think we would find that across the schools, the students are, pushing. It's not a kind of top-down anymore. They're really pushing questions of whether it's questions of diversity, questions of how do we engage a kind of global urban condition, the kind of questions of climate change and what is it that they're going to have to deal with that we're leaving. And there's a lot of, but at the same time, of course, they're coming to, to get, to learn how to ask questions, to produce form, to gain skills, to understand. So I think it's not so, in terms of like your question about I wouldn't call them masters, but I think that there is desire to, learn from people who obviously otherwise you wouldn't, kind of engage with those institutions. But so I think it's across the schools, it's a different moment now where education is changing quite radically in terms of like what is it that we can offer that someone can't find on their own. And I think, kind of trying to provide all the means to ask the right questions and then for the students to shape a mode of engagement or practice or however they want to engage architecture is kind of both challenging and exciting. So.
Mark, you had your hands up. Two more.
Hi, thank you. So I'm the chair of admissions here, and I just spent the last 2 weeks telling tons of people how terrible all of you are, and your schools are such horrible, horrible places. It's of course not true. It's of course not true. No, really, just to follow up on what Michelle said, such an incredible vibrancy and diversity. One thing I wanted to ask, however, was there are some common themes struggling with what the meaning of research is, the kind of network globalization, the image that Will put up of what's happening now that wasn't happening 10 years ago. It's almost as if there's 1,000 possible different directions and things to address in architecture school. And I was just kind of reminiscing a little bit. I was teaching at Columbia under Shumi, and there was a feeling at the time that we were doing something really radical and progressive and taboo almost, that it wasn't architecture, according to a great majority of the architectural population. And I just wonder if there's is it just there's too much going on right now for there even to be such a thing as a radical or progressive proposition in architecture school? Is it just that there's 1,000 things going on and every school is going to kind of take 10 and twist them around in different ways? Or do we all try to teach a little bit of all the thousands? But really, is there such thing as a a radical architecture? Is there a radical thing you could do in architecture school? What could one do to challenge the status quo when really everybody is totally comfortable teaching global networking, mapping, political structures, swarm intelligences? There's really nothing off limits. Or is there? Except maybe building.
Yeah. But I think the challenge is not is the lines that we draw matter. They're not disconnected from all the things that you've shared. Like the building is where all these forces are coming together. The building doesn't exist outside of these forces. So I think the challenge is not to proliferate, but to converge and to understand that within even the scale of the building is a frame and a window onto, I mean, we are not in the 90s. A lot of things have happened since then. And I think it's just the world has changed. So how does the world changing, how does climate change architecture? How does, I mean, Kuhl has spent his entire life trying to see, or late life trying to see how globalization changes architecture, and he only scratched the surface. I mean, how do we teach history? How do, we call ourselves global. We're kind of just scratching the surface. So it's not so much, for me at least, it's not so much this proliferation, but actually this convergence. And it's, the students are the ones converging, but in what they make. So.
I am uncomfortable with the everything goes prevalent notion.
What does everything goes? What does that mean? Everything goes.
I mean, it seems as if everything is the subject of architecture, and I am not so sure that everything is and should be the subject of architecture. And I do think that what we do as architects when we build the physical world around us is extremely important and extremely powerful. Yes, we do it in the context of socio-economical, political realities, but I am not sure that the socio-political, economic realities are the subject in themselves. And I do worry, and perhaps it's because I've been doing this now for 8 years of being a dean, I do worry that we are losing, what is that expression, the forest for the trees? I mean, or the trees for the forest, I always get it backwards. I do worry that we're spending an exorbitant amount of time dealing with issues that are actually better dealt with outside of architecture. And I do worry that by putting architecture in certain conversations where architecture might not be best situated, we're actually contributing to cover up those issues. So for example, if you ask me, what is the biggest challenge of sustainability in the 21st century? My answer would be legislation. And until we change legislation, whatever we do as designers is actually minute to impact the environment. So I worry that by putting architecture at the foreground of some of these topics, we actually help power structures obfuscate the real issues. When we talk about inequities, a topic that is very dear to my heart, again, as architects, our power is very limited. So if we foreground architecture, then we may actually help cover up the fact that bigger societal changes need to take place. So I think we can talk about the design of buildings for certain conditions, but not necessarily as addressing inequity or solving inequity. And I'm using this as quick, sort of low-hanging fruit examples, right? That doesn't mean that architecture has to be at the service of power structures always. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried about design for emergency conditions, or that doesn't mean that we don't have to care about the potential for design impacting the situation of the homeless. I mean, that doesn't mean that architecture should not care about society. But I do think personally that we need to be a little bit more careful and more modest as to what our impact in society truly is. and how we in fact represent culture.
Can I bring the two terms back together? Because the idea that radical and pluralist are opposed is not necessarily the case. The radical is about constant change, and that the source of that constant change could come from everywhere, from different experiments and experiences. Now, the balance between the two is how to orchestrate, how to make sure, which I think is what you're concerned about, how to make sure that these pluralities of experiences somehow bring something back home to the radical, to the framework so that we can transform it. And I think the balance between the two is what our role as pedagogical institutions allows us to do. I think, sorry,
No,
just
go
to
ahead,
add
go
one thing, what your question was about, though, was where does the radical reside? And you're right, maybe it is this kind of exhaustive scrutiny from point of view of research and science and validation, et cetera, that has diminished our ability to say this is radical or to declare that we've broken new grounds, because the experiment has to be validated through very discrete channels. In the meantime, I think if you look at the desks of the students and what's in front of them, what they're looking at and what they understand to be radical is coming to them from the profession. It's not coming to them from academia anymore. So maybe that's one thing we need to talk about and think about, is how do we take it and turn it around a little bit.
I just want to clarify, for me, it's not about a kind of solving problem, and actually I wouldn't reduce the problem to a kind of technological or architecture to a sort of, performance. Yeah, of course, I don't think anybody in this room believes that, just by performance we're going to, even though we need to do it. For me, it's how we teach history. If you think about climate change, you teach the history of modernization slightly differently. It's fundamental, what is the canon, what we call the canon, who are the references that we use, who is the audience, our student bodies have changed, they come from, a very wide, and they're not diverse enough. So I want to, Jennifer's point, students do come to me, and I think Mabel's incredible conference on race and modern architecture is really critical. For me, Rifat Chadiji, brought all these things into buildings. You look at these buildings and they contain so much, including, exquisite form and materiality in terms of exploration. It's not a divergence, it's a convergence. But I do think that, changing or whatever the status quo, well, first we need to understand what that status quo is, or allow for the students to articulate these questions for themselves. So.
Maybe part two of Mark's question here. And maybe add a new question, which we haven't really talked about yet, tenure. Tenure.
You haven't heard of it.
That gets.
Princeton problem.
That gets to my point. 2 years ago, I had a conversation with the dean of an eminent school of architecture, who told me that tenure is the worst thing that ever happened to could happen to a school of architecture. These are changing times. Deans have to be higher and fire. And that's the way it is. And tenure gums things up. Today's cool is tomorrow's dead weight. And the last thing you want is dead weights. So we have here an array of leaders who are in various tenure, or I don't know about you, Will, but yeah, exactly.
I've signed my resignation letter already and dated it. So
But at least I know that my boss is in charge of a school where definitely tenure means something. So we have definitely an array of different attitudes here. So I'm curious as to what your philosophical or theoretical take is on this problem.
I'm going to tell your faculty out there.
Completely in this room, yeah.
So, tenure is a Princeton problem, tenure is a University of Michigan problem, tenure is a Harvard problem. So those are the institutions where I have spent most of my career, and then now I'm new at Princeton. I have to say, at Michigan I did 3 to 4 cases a year. So I consider myself sort of an expert on the problem of architecture schools at a research university. And one thing that I did early on is that I did away with the notion of design as research. And instead, I argued that design was a creative practice, and that it was a creative practice equal to creative writing in the Department of Creative Writing, or equal to music composition in music. And when I did that, it actually unraveled the problem of designers somehow not being understood, quote unquote, by the university, and put architecture in a completely different conversation, truly at the intersection of the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Because the humanities were understood and well taken care of. A historian in architecture, it was understood what she or he needed to do. Somebody in building technology, it was understood what he or she was supposed to do. But somehow the designer was trying to be shoehorned into either model when there are other models at the university that actually are well understood and that have long histories. So for me, the idea, the issue of tenure actually has helped me understand the discipline itself as well. So my comments about design did not come from the business school or the engineering version of design, which has its own shapes and forms. It actually came from the arts.
Can I answer that too? I think that, I found a file that thick full of memos arguing with the university about this precise issue, and worked really hard with some others to convince the university to basically elevate what they already had in their verbiage about tenure and what research is, to be very, very clear about creative accomplishment as part of research, scholarship and creative accomplishment, and be able to use those terms regularly. I think the other thing that we clarified, which I think had been a hang-up, is what are the criteria on which a creative production, an accomplishment, is evaluated. It's not enough to build something. You actually have to have some evidence that what you've done contributes to the field, the thinking in the field, the technology, the ideas. And so there are criteria for review. And that has made cases go very smoothly.
But is your question whether we're struggling with the university or whether we're for or against or mixed about tenure?
Yeah, I'm not interested in tenure process. I as associate dean, I know all about that.
Oh, okay.
I'm interested in arguing for it or against it. In other words, in manipulating it. I mean, I do is a tenure line, or do I outsource it to young faculty, or do I actually go for someone that I can actually permanent? There's no sort of permanent versus impermanent proportionality. Some schools are very high in permanent, very low in impermanent. Other schools like here are very high in impermanent, very low in permanent. These change your attitude towards how you can both, argue for certain types of relationships to contemporary practice.
I have always been for permanent. I think that you build a culture over time. I think that the students benefit from that culture that has built over time. But I understand the challenges of institutions that cannot do that cannot build the permanent. And I understand the AA model as an alternative that is actually quite valid, that builds permanence in different ways without depending on tenure to build the permanence.
Yeah, I think I would echo Monica in that I think tenure was fundamental. At the same time, it's an art and not a science in terms of, the kind of proportion and the ingredients. But I would say that it is going to come, it just is going to come under increasing pressure because there is no retirement age, there is a kind of, push down, and, there's a new generation popping up, and as the paradigm shifts, and, that conversation can be productive, but it can also be difficult. And so, something is going to have to give a little bit, I think.
Just want to add one thing, is that it's not surprising that the questioning of tenure is happening exactly at the same time as universities are increasing the power of middle management and administration outside of faculty rule. And I found the parallel suspicious.
Yale has a very famous law school down the road, one of the other professional schools on the campus, and it takes great pride that it doesn't just produce lawyers. Apparently, Columbia Law School is famous for producing the corporate lawyers. You know, the expectation is that people become presidents or activists or start not-for-profits or whatever. So where do you stand? Do we educate practitioners? Do we educate practitioners solely? Or could we imagine an architect, for example, becoming a president?
Bob, you're up for it?
In moments of despair, I have evoked the model of the Yale Law School as being one where a small school manages to outshine the bigger schools by the way that it defines the training of a lawyer in a very, very radically different way, and holds onto it as being the production of an alternative for a long period of time. Yes, I admire that model, and I think we should look at it as being another possibility, particularly for the smaller schools, the ones that do not want to be trade schools.
I think the professions of law doctors are being fundamentally challenged and won't exist in the same state. I think in Britain, the protection of title argument is particularly boring. I would want our graduates to just go off and do interesting things, whether that's using their spatial intelligence to design cities or be mayors or write music or just be interesting and innovate and make sure they're involved in creating new stuff. And hopefully some of that is making really great architecture. But I think this idea that calling yourself an architect is, this sort of 19th century view that it transforms you from, a class-based system from one point to another point is just not interesting.
I guess I would say that I think our goal is to produce people who are interested in practice, but in a wide range of activities. They really go out and wind up in doing all kinds of interesting things, and that seems okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for an incredible afternoon.